In Python, there are two really important numeric types, integers and floats. There's actually a third numeric type, something called a complex. It doesn't come up anywhere near as much, but we can talk about that later. We're going to start with integers and floats, two different numeric types. Why is there a distinction? Well, integers are for whole numbers only, so no decimal points. They could be positive, they could be negative, they could be really huge, they could be 0 or 1. Here's some examples. 9, 378, negative 21. Those are examples of integers. Now there's the second type I mentioned, floats, or floating point numbers. These are numbers that have a decimal point, and they can also be positive or negative. So 1.5, or 9.99, or negative 2.0. If we have a decimal point, even if it's a whole number, if there's a decimal, it's a float. If there's no decimal point, it's an integer. So here's a few more examples of both. Here's a very large integer. Here's 0 as an integer. Here is 0 as a float, 0.0. Here's a very long, well, not a large number, but a very long float with a lot of numbers after the decimal point. If you need help remembering the names, think of floats as a little guy floating up a tube between the different steps, whereas integers are these discrete steps, these intervals. You can't float between them. I don't know if that helps or not. Okay, so let's play around with some floats and integers really quickly. I'm going to use IPython on my Mac. If you're on Windows, you can open up PowerShell, or you can use the command prompt, type IPython. If that's not working for you, this should be recap, you can just use regular old Python. It will work. And if you gave up on installation, or you didn't want to install, or you just want to use Replit, use the console over here. This is Python right there, ready to go. So when I say that we're going to play around with numbers, there's not a lot we can do right now. We can type a number in, like 12. Make this a bit larger here. Pop quiz, is that an integer or float? That is an integer. And if I hit enter right now, well, it screams or whispers 12 back to me. It just repeats whatever I say. This is interactive Python, so if I have another integer, it's going to just repeat it back to me. I can have a really long integer. In fact, in Python, integers are actually unbounded, at least in Python 3. That's not the case for Python 2. All that means is that they can be as large as we want. So there's a very large one. And here's a negative one. Now, here's a float. 4.0 or 4.9, 1, 2, 3. That is a floating point number. It has a decimal. Now, I'm telling you that there's a difference, but how do we actually know? How do we know that Python cares, that it distinguishes the two? Well, we can use this little thing called type. We're going to learn more about this. It's a function. So this is kind of introducing something that's coming up in a section or two from now. And whatever we provide between the parentheses to type, whatever we put in there, it's going to tell us, Python is going to tell us the type of that number. Or it doesn't have to be a number, but we only know numbers. If I do type of 6, it says that is an int for integer. I'm going to hit the up arrow, and that's going to allow me to scroll through lines I've already typed, up and down arrow. And I'm just going to do 6.8. So there's a decimal in there. Now it tells me that is actually a float. So there's some proof that there's a difference. Why is there a difference? It has to do with how Python does math and stores floating point numbers with decimals versus integers. And it's actually more about how your computer stores them. And the hardware circuits involved to do math with decimals versus to do math with whole numbers. It's a lot harder. It takes up more memory to do math with floats versus ints. So they are separated out in Python, as with most programming languages, but not all. One important note about floats, I'm going to just clear my screen here, Control L, is that they are not unbounded. I will come up against a limit of precision. Let's just say I have something, let's actually do just a bunch of 3s and keep going here. That's enough. If I hit enter here, I'm not going to see the same number repeated back to me. We see a much smaller version of that number. So there is a level of precision that we run up against with floats. That's not usually something that's a problem. I mean, if you're doing really intense, like, I don't know, atomic calculations or something, maybe you need to consider it. But day to day, it's not something that you need to be concerned with. But it is good to know that they're not just infinitely precise. And that's pretty much it for this intro to floats and integers. Two different categories, two different types of numbers. Remember, integers are whole, negative or positive. Floats have a decimal point, also negative or positive. Floats take up more space to store and do math with, which is why they get their own type in Python. Even though they're just numbers, just like integers, they are numbers with decimals.